Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. Ms. Campbell, would you call the roll for us?
Mr. Hannigan? Here. Mrs. Hines?
Here.
Mr. Derman? Here. Mr. Loop? Here. Mr. Harrell? Here. Mr. Nation?
Here.
Mr. Jeter?
Here.
Mrs. Seeley?
Present.
Mrs. Drucker?
Here.
Mr. Betancourt?
Here.
Mr. Womack?
Here.
Mr. Hersey?
Here.
Mrs. Mullet? Mr. Kuzan?
Here.
Mrs. Bellisario?
Thank you so much. Would you please rise and join us in the pledge and invocation, which will be led by Mr. Nation?
Let us pray. Direct us, O Lord, with your most gracious favor, that all our work, begun, continued, and ended in you, may find favor in your sight, and finally, by your mercy, may we each obtain everlasting life. This we pray through Christ our Lord. Amen. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. Appreciate that. I'd like to welcome you all to our July 12th meeting. I know that our staff has been very busy this summer getting things ready for our next school year, and we appreciate that. Our first agenda item is recognition of visitors. Do we have anyone that our board members would like to recognize in the audience this evening? All right, if not, we'll move on to the next thing, persons requesting time on the agenda. We did not have anyone sign up for time on the agenda. So we'll move to approval of the minutes from the committee as a whole meeting held last month. Do I have a motion to accept those minutes from the June 7th meeting? I have a motion by Ms. Drucker and a second by Ms. Seeley. Do we have any comments from board members? Any comments from the public? If not, could we open the machine for voting, please? Voting on the minutes. Mr. Hennigan? All right, the voting is complete. We'll close the voting, and if Ms. Campbell can give us the results, please. All right, we have 14 yeas and 1 abstention. The motion carries. All right, our next item is consideration of the job description for building manager. Mr. Kose.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. The building manager job description is attached for your viewing on board docs. This is not a new position. An employee was shifted to these responsibilities since 2007 when the central office made the move to this building, the C.J. Shane Administrative Complex. We felt it is prudent to create the appropriate job description for these responsibilities, and we're asking for the board's approval tonight.
So moved. Second.
All right, we have a motion by Mr. Derman and a second by Mr. Loop on that. Do we have comments on the job description for building manager from board members? Do we have any comments on that from the public? If not, we'll move to vote on the job description for building manager. Let's see, Mr. Derman? All right, we have the voting complete. All right, we have 15 yeas for that, so that motion carries for the building manager. Now we'll move on to instruction. Our first item is the pupil progression 2018-19 updates. We have Mr. Carlo and Ms. Strataberger here for those updates.
Good evening. Ms. Heinz, Superintendent Foltz, members of the board, and guests. Tonight, Mr. Carlo and I will review the 2018-2019 Pupil Progression Advisory Process, as well as address the 2018-2019 recommendations for revisions put forth by the Pupil Progression Advisory Committee. The Pupil Progression Review process began with receiving input from report card and principal focus groups. This input was then shared and discussed with the principals during the spring principal meetings. Final input was gathered electronically. The aggregated input was presented and discussed with the Pupil Progression Plan Advisory Committee at the April meeting. These points of consideration were then reviewed at the public input meeting held at Lakeshore High School in early May. The Advisory Committee held a meeting on May 16th to further discuss all considerations and make final proposed recommendations. These discussions included an analysis of all perspectives and possible outcomes. Tonight, we will present the final proposed recommendations for your consideration. The Advisory Committee's function is to review and make recommendations for revision, if necessary, based on all received input. The Advisory Committee consists of administrators, parents, and teachers representing elementary, middle, junior, and high schools across the district. The St. Tammany Parish Public Schools makes a commitment to our community through its mission statement to engage all students in a high-quality education resulting in lifelong learners who can contribute to the society in which they live. As part of this commitment, our Pupil Progression Plan embodies the mission statement, serving as the district's governing policy to be reviewed and revised annually. Mr. Carlo will now share the most recent BESI policy updates to Bulletin 1566 that directly impact the district's pupil progression plan.
In Section 701 of Bulletin 1566, it is supporting struggling students with an early identification process. That early identification process will begin by analyzing the fourth grade students' LEAP 2025 scores. The student must score an acceptable level of performance, which is defined as scoring at least basic in 3 of the core academic subjects: ELA, math, science, or social studies. If a student does not reach the acceptable level of performance, then an individual academic plan will be devised. This plan will ensure that the struggling student receives individualized interventions and supports that foster academic growth. The individual academic plan will follow the student through the 8th grade or until the acceptable levels of performance are reached. This revised section does not affect a student's grade level promotion. Promotion is still determined by meeting the expectations as defined in the district's pupil progression plan. An additional revision to Bulletin 1566 is also included in Chapter 5, Section 503. This new policy addresses placement for students transferring into Louisiana public schools. So any student seeking to transfer to a public school in grades 5 and 9 from any in-state non-public school, any approved home study program, or any out-of-state school shall be required to pass the English, language arts, and mathematics portions of the state placement test. The state's placement test is a computer-based test. It is designed to measure students' knowledge and skills in ELA and math pursuant to Louisiana student standards in grades 4 and 8. So, after a diligent review of all proposed stakeholder considerations, the major topics regarding local policy considerations to be discussed this evening include grading policy change in first grade, grading policy changes in grades 4th through 8, promotion requirement changes in grades 4th through 8, and ranking class for grades 9 through 12. The advisory committee's rationale behind all the recommendations presented this evening is to promote consistency of grading practices and promotion requirements so that parents, students, and school staff have a clear, universal representation of student achievement across all grade levels. Each proposed recommendation will require a separate board vote for approval. For each of the recommendations, a corresponding handout was made available for your reference. That handout illustrates a comparison between the existing 2017-18 local policy and the proposed 2018-19 revisions.
All right, at this time, before we start
Sure.
in with the recommendations, I'd like to ask if any board members have any questions regarding the process or the revisions to Bulletin 1566. Okay, if not, then we'll go ahead and we'll start with the first recommendation.
Okay, so as illustrated on handout number 1, the advisory committee's first recommendation involves kindergarten, transitional first, and first grades. The proposed recommendation is to revise the grading policy to combine writing, speaking and listening, and language into one language arts grade. The advisory committee's rationale for the proposed revision is to support alignment of grading policy in grades K through 8.
All right, we'll queue up for questions on recommendation number 1. Does anyone have any questions on recommendation number 1? Mr. Hennigan?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Hines. Just kind of an observation, I'm not going to make a big deal of this, but I would have kept it the same. I mean, to me, it's nice to get a further breakdown on a child's, where he or she might need help, it could be speaking, could be listening, that's a concern. You've taken away a little bit of fidelity in what the problem is. And I know it makes it easier and you can compare grade to grade, but, for those first few grades, I recall when I went to school, it was different from the first couple of grades in school. They graded this stuff, penmanship and listening, and there's a lot more check boxes.
The committee, Mr. Hennigan, did request the alignment. All of these things will still be graded in gradebook as activities and assignments. So you will still be able to see, as the parents have access to that, so they'll be able to see in the broad spectrum of language arts, which area is causing concern. The committee believed and felt that the best way to help a parent and a child through this is through a parent conference at this young age, and not so many assessments if they're doing so well or if they're struggling. We want to spend more time teaching, and so they wanted the 9 grades to be in language arts, yet we can see which components of these would be a weakness or a strength because of the assignments and JPAMs.
Okay, but out of curiosity, let's suppose a student had a hearing problem, maybe it's, physical, and how would the parent, how would you grade that? Person may be able to speak and may be able to read.
And we have many children who are nonverbal, so I can totally appreciate your point. Not many, but we have several children who are, and they have other communication devices, et cetera, or ways to communicate, and it's the teacher's responsibility to engage that child, to assess that child through the form of communication, whatever it might be, that they can express their learning and their growth and progress. So their grade would be including the accommodations and the devices that help them express themselves. So they'd be assessing the same basic standard or concept, but their way of communicating it would be through the device that makes them comfortable or the method that makes them comfortable, whether it's pointing or a special electronic device or pictures.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And if, Mr. Hennigan, if you also look on your handout in red, we are going to add, there's the statement in red to ensure that the speaking and the listening, all of those components are included in the grade. That in red at the top, that statement is presently not in pupil progression, but if passed, it would be included. So that's also to ensure that it remains. You're welcome.
Ms. Bellisario?
Just so I understand, the parent will see a language arts grade. Where will they see these individual grades that Mr. Hennigan was talking about?
In gradebook, in JPANs.
Okay.
Not on the actual report card.
Which they have access to?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Ms. Seeley?
Come on, you're supposed to say.
Would you please explain for the public what the grade letters of O, S, and N are?
O is outstanding, S satisfactory, N needs improvement, and all of these are based on growth towards the standard.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions from board members? Do we have any questions from the public on recommendation number 1? Mr. Broom, would you come up? State your name, please.
Thank you. My name is Robert Broom, and I didn't get the handout in advance. Sorry about that. But I have a question. It was mentioned that this will reduce the number of assessments. Is the goal of this to reduce the number of assessments to increase teaching time, or is it to consolidate into one grade? It sounds to me like there's two separate goals here.
The overall goal is to do what would best provide instruction and learning for our children. That's everything. There are all kinds of assessments. Assessments can be formative assessments where you don't necessarily put a letter grade down for them or grade down for them, but it helps you to know what to do next so that the child can improve and can grow and learn. The report card itself is a form, Lewis taught me this. The report card itself is a formal academic record that is passed on for life for a child. Whereas grade books, parents can see and teachers can see where the next point of instruction is. But do we really need, when we go, to 10th grade, to know that in kindergarten or transitional first grade or first grade that I struggled with speaking or writing or listening? So we can still assess these things in grade book, but you get one language arts grade, so their strengths as well as their areas of need in the language arts area are all considered for one grade on their formal academic record.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Ms. Hines, if I could, just make sure everybody understands what we're trying to do to make it as simple as possible. For each one of these recommendations, you have a sheet. The red is things that has been struck out or added. That's at the top from 17-18. Below that is 18-19, how it would read. We thought it best to vote on each one of these
Yes.
individually, so I think you should do that as well. Certainly, they can answer questions. Dr. Sanford can answer questions. And I'm going to ask Regina just one more time to share with everyone the makeup of the committees and how these came about, so everyone will understand the entire process and the input before we start doing any voting.
We had two different subcommittees. One was a report card subcommittee composed of various stakeholders. I believe that Ms. Heinz was a member of that report card committee. And that committee then brought all of the input to the advisory committee for consideration. So it went through 2 levels prior to coming to you. And then the second subcommittee was a principal focus committee where those principals gathered input from all of their staff members and stakeholders within their schools, and they brought recommendations to the advisory committee. So there are 2 different levels before you're even seeing this.
Thank you.
All right, any other comments? If not, we'll open voting for recommendation number 1 to the pupil progression plan. Oh, I'm sorry, we do need a motion. All right, I have a motion from Ms. Mullet and a second from Ms. Seeley. Thank you, Mr. Nation, for that. All right, we're voting on recommendation number 1. I think you, everyone has voted, and you'll reveal the vote, please. All right, we have 15 yeas for that, so recommendation number 1 passes. All right, Mr. Carlo, recommendation number 2.
Recommendation number 2 is for kindergarten and transitional first grade to revise the grading of conduct to include O for outstanding. The advisory committee's rationale for the proposed revision is to support, again, the alignment of grading practices in each of the subject areas, including conduct, represented on the K through first grade report cards.
All right, Ms. Mellon, do you want to make a motion? All right, and let's see, we'll have Mr. Womack second it. Now, we'll have discussion on this recommendation. Mr. Hennigan?
I'm pulling, so I noticed that speaking and listening will be graded on this revision. You might want to take that out.
It will not. So
Okay.
your handout is not a progressive handout of the changes throughout the
okay,
year
okay.
because I could not predetermine what you guys would
vote.
approve or not. So the top of your handout is strictly 2017-18 in red with what the revision would be. The bottom just simply shows you the revision of what we are Xing as the recommendation. It is not a progressive handout
Okay.
in
Thank
any
you.
which way.
Very, very good.
Sometimes we can read your mind, Mr. Hennigan, but sometimes we don't want to go there.
We
That's a good
knew that
thing.
would come up, but
All right. Any other questions, Mr. Hennigan? Any other questions? Mr. Womack?
Excuse my ignorance, but what is the difference between first grade and transitional first grade?
Transitional first grade is between kindergarten and first grade.
It's what now?
It comes between kindergarten and first grade. For children who are not quite ready for first grade, there's a developmental screening that the teachers give in kindergarten. And children who are at risk that just need a little bit more time, many times it's children whose birth dates are in late August, early September. And so they just need a little bit more time. So they have a year that they still work on kindergarten standards, that they have gaps, and then they work on some of the beginning first grade standards. So they progress to first grade as strong students and mature and developed in order to be able to handle the rigor of first grade.
Would that also include children like in special ed pre-K that are classified as autistic?
It doesn't, we don't distinguish as far as whether or not they can be accepted or not in T1 because of that. But the distinguishing mark is what is causing the delay. If it is better for a child who is serviced with an IEP to go to first grade and continue on the path with, his other peers and do well, and the gaps can be addressed through the IEP, we would rather have the child go to first grade and have the gaps addressed through the IEP. If the child himself or herself is also very typically very, very young and needs the extra year, the IEP can also be addressed in T1. So it depends on each individual child. We don't accept or reject based on a special need, but we certainly want to service them in whatever grade is best for them.
Well, as long as they're showing progression as a result of the work that's been put forth by the menagerie of teachers in the special pre-K, then they could still potentially transition, fall into that category, transitional first grade.
They can do either, and it's
Based on the
always.
IEP.
Yes, sir, and it's always a parent's choice. Transitional first grade is really not based on an IEP. It's a parent's choice and a teacher's conversation based on a developmental screening to make sure that another year is really going to make a difference for them and that they'll be more successful and strong as a result of that other year. The IEP goals, and Jeannie, you can help me if I say this wrong, their IEP goals are met through whatever the IEP states they should be doing and how they should be progressing, and that can frequently be done in first grade. It depends on the child.
Yes.
And let me just say, and I know I was going to add what Ms. Lane just said, this is always with parental consent. And the other part of it, I will tell you, I hear tremendous success stories all the time from T1 students, all the time. Parents have gone through this communication, meet with the kindergarten teachers in the first grade, and the success stories that come out of it. There are plenty of them.
Thank you.
Well, I can attest to what you're saying, Mr. Foles, because that's precisely what's happened with my granddaughter. They've helped her tremendously.
All right, Mr. Womack, do you have any other questions?
No, I don't, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Betancourt?
No, the question I had was just answered. I was going to ask about if it was up to the parents or not. Thank you.
Ms. Sealy?
Thank you. At one time, I know this has been around for years, I do recall that social maturity was a tremendous part of child placement in the transitional grade. Is that still in place?
Yes, it is. The screening includes things, can children follow 1, 2, 3-step directions? Can they play cooperatively with others? Do they cry real easily? Do they need, support and warning for things coming and change? So those are all part of the screening, and you have to look at the whole picture. So you look at the physical, the social emotional, the academic, all of it together to see just what the child needs.
All right, if there are no other questions from board members, do we have any comments from the public on the grading of conduct to include O for outstanding in kindergarten and transitional first? If not, then we'll have Ms. Mullet made the motion, Mr. Womack seconded it, and would we open the voting, please? Voting on recommendation number 2. Is that? All right, we have 15 yeas. We'll move on to recommendation number 3.
Recommendation 3 is involving first grade, and this is to revise the grading policy to include reading, language arts, math, science, and social studies to be graded A, B, C, D, or F. The advisory committee's rationale for the proposed revision is to support a universal representation and communication of student achievement in grades 1 through 12.
And I have a motion by Ms. Drucker to accept that. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, second by Mr. Jeter. Now, could we open the discussion, please? Discussion on the grading policy to include reading, language arts, math, science, social studies to be graded A, B, C, D, or F in first grade. Mr. Kuzan.
The handwriting was eliminated, and I would just like to ask the question, how do you grade handwriting?
Handwriting is actually part of writing. So within the language arts, letter formation is still taught in all these lower grades. It's critically important for children, but it is taught within the content of writing.
How do you incorporate it with the other grading?
It's in language arts, so it would be part of that language arts, because written language is part of it. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Kuzan. Ms. Drucker.
I just wanted some clarification. I was just looking, I just want to make sure I'm reading this accurately. This is for first grade. And the letter grades are A, B, C, D, and F. And then flipping back to number 2 that we just went over, that is strictly grading for social, emotional development and fine motor development, whereas this one is strictly work habits. Right.
No.
First one was, number 2 was conduct.
Number 2 is strictly conduct. So if you look in your handout, look at number 3, and you'll notice at the very top of number 3, our present grading system is OS or END. So to replace that, it would be with A, B, C, D, or F.
Whereas before on number 2, it includes first grade, and it says OS in it.
But
Am I getting this confused?
don't go backward. Only look at number 3 and look at the top. That way you can see what is the current policy.
Okay, so.
Because it's not progressive, so it doesn't change once you vote. This didn't change, so just look at the top, and you can see we're in red. So the only thing we need to change is OS, N, or U to A, B, C, D, or F. We did not change the bottom part at all, because we can't do it yet until final approval.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the
Oh,
clarification.
you're welcome.
All right, Mr. Welbeck?
I think Ms. Drucker just had the same thing on her mind that's on mine, and I think that she just got the answer that I probably need. But what mitigating
Factors have to do with not using the outstanding, the alternate grading scale. You elected to go to traditional grading. What went into that?
That was definitely a committee recommendation. I just want to share with you the numbers on our committee. We had 16 teachers, 9 parents, 5 administrators, and Ms. Hines and myself were there, and 11 schools were represented, east, west, rural, pre-K through first grade, pre-K through K, pre-K through 3, pre-K through 5, pre-K through 8. So we had a broad repertoire there. That is one thing that was came extreme just from them, and they were really hopeful for it. The parents felt that it was much clearer, that S could be children who are a B student, could be children who are a C student, and depending on teachers, it could be a D student. They felt that this was more clear for them to be able to see exactly how their kids were in line with being ready for second and third grade.
So there was quite a bit that went into that decision then.
There was a.
Indeed.
Yes, sir.
Well, I don't recall us ever using this grading method before. This is a first, is it not?
I'm not sure it's a first. I do know, I myself have used that grading scale, so that's how antique it is.
The outstanding.
But the outstanding and the satisfactory and all has been what we've had in place here for probably 25 years.
Really? Thank you for the clarity.
Ms. Belisario?
I thought I was following pretty well, but I just have a quick question. We're still leaving kindergarten with those other letters,
Yes, ma'am.
right?
Kindergarten and transitional first still
Still
stay
have the-
OS in
Yes.
there.
Good clarification.
All right, any other questions from board members? If not, do we have questions from the public on the recommendation number 3? Oh, I already have a motion on this one. Thank you. Any questions from the public? All right, if not, we'll queue up for voting on recommendation number 3. Ms. Drucker made the motion, Mr. Jeter seconded. Waiting patiently.
What are we waiting on?
Recommendation number 3, the tally.
That's nice.
Oh, yeah. Down at the bottom, it says, motion carries. We have one nay from Mr. Kuzan.
All right, at the bottom of the screen, it says the motion passed 14-1 with one nay vote. So we'll move on to recommendation number 4.
Recommendation number 4 involves promotion for grades 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. The recommendation is to revise the promotion requirement for grades 4, 5, and 6 by removing the sentence combining one major and two minor subjects. The advisory's rationale for the proposal is to ensure consistency of 6th grade promotion requirements across the district, no matter if a student is enrolled in 6th grade on a middle or elementary campus or on a junior high campus.
All right, Mr. Loop is making a motion that we accept recommendation number 4. We have a second from Mr. Jeter. Do we have questions from board members on recommendation number 4? Ms. Campbell, can you queue up? Any questions? Ms. Mullet?
Board members, please don't take this the wrong way, but we did not see the vote from the last time, and I know all votes must be public. So you did say that one vote was no, and I'm not sure if we probably should say those votes out loud, that one vote of no out loud, because the public does deserve to know each and every vote.
Mr. Kuzan, did you vote nay on that? On recommendation number 3? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's all. I just
That's
wanted to
fine.
make sure that we did that correctly. Thank you.
All right. Ms. Seeley, questions on recommendation number 4?
Thank you. The question I have is, does that mean that they may be promoted if they have failure grades in the minor subjects now?
When you are looking at the line that is Xed out, a combination of any one major subject and two minor subjects. So you're still they will still receive on those junior high campuses those grades. And yes, if they do have the F, it does not affect promotion. When you're looking at an elementary and middle school 6th grader, they are not being graded A, B, C, D, F in those subjects. It is O, S, and N, or U.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Womack?
Make sure I'm clear on it. Why was this verbiage struck out on the bottom?
Because if I am a 6th grader, and I'm going to use St. Tammany Junior High for instance, if I make an F in language, an F in PE, and an F in art, I'm going to fail 6th grade.
I suspect so.
If I am a 6th grader, though, at Little Oak Middle, and I make a F in language, a U in art, and a U in PE, I can be promoted. So we are trying to make sure that promotion for all 6th graders, regardless of what school that they are attending, it is the same.
And that U means?
Unsatisfactory, but
Okay.
it does not affect promotional status,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
it's not considered an elective.
Thank you for the answer.
Sure.
Mr. Betancourt?
Thank you, Mrs. Hines. The way this reads, it seems like there should be a little bit more to the, any two of the other major subjects, because the way that reads, it's like reading and math are not major subjects. And I would think that they are, right?
Yes, they are. And actually, Bulletin 1566 is making ELA, math, science, and social studies your major content areas. So as we progress forward, hopefully you'll notice the change in the language.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, any other questions from board members? Any questions from the public concerning recommendation number 4? If not, we have a motion by Mr. Loop and a second by Mr. Jeter. Ms. Campbell, could you queue up voting, please? Mr. Womack, did you vote?
I'm sorry?
Did you vote?
I'm sorry.
Okay, voting is complete. We'll close voting. Recommendation number 4 passes 15-0. Thank you very much. We'll move on to recommendation number 5.
Recommendation 5 involves 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grade, and we're talking about grading. To revise the grading policy for grades 4, 5, and 6 to include combining reading and language into one English language arts grade. Rationale is to ensure alignment of grading practices to the curriculum and instructional pedagogy that is utilized in grades 4, 5, and 6.
All right, we have the motion by Ms. Mullett, and Mr. Derman has seconded. Do we have any comments from board members? Any comments from board members on recommendation number 5? All right, any comments from the public on recommendation number 5? If not, we'll vote on recommendation number 5 for the pupil progression plan. Right, that one passes with 15 yea votes. We'll move on to recommendation number 6. Ms. Strataberger.
Thank you. Recommendation number 6 involves 7th and 8th grades. This revision was submitted by the principal focus group. The proposed recommendation is to revise the grading policy for grades 7 and 8 to include combining reading and language into one English language arts grade. Just as in recommendation number 5, the advisory committee's rationale for the proposed revision is to ensure alignment of grading practices to the curriculum and instruction pedagogy utilized in grades 7 and 8.
Right, do I have a motion? I have a motion by Ms. Drucker and a second by Mr. Hershey. Do we have any questions from board members? Any questions from board members? Do we have any questions from the public on recommendation number 6? All right, we have a motion by Ms. Drucker and a second by Mr. Hershey on recommendation number 6. We'll open the voting, please. Mr. Kuzan, have you completed your vote? Mr. Kuzan? Okay. And we have 15 yeas on that, so we'll move on to recommendation number 7.
Recommendation number 7 also involves 7th and 8th grades. This, too, was brought to you by the principal focus group. The proposed recommendation is to revise the promotion requirement for grades 7th and 8th to include passing reading and math as well as one of the following subjects, science or social studies. The advisory committee's rationale for the proposed revision is to assure alignment of promotion requirements in grades 2 through 8, as well as to support a healthier transition from 6th to 7th grade.
All right, do I have a motion to accept recommendation number 7?
Second.
All right, I have Ms. Seeley and Mr. Jeter making the second on that. Do we have questions from board members on recommendation number 7? Ms. Shanigan, do you have a question?
Yeah, just quickly, just so if I failed math and social studies, I would pass?
No.
So
You
I have to fail.
You have to pass 3 of the 4
Okay,
core
but is it-
content areas to pass.
if she fails, or he, English, so I have to fail English and math, is what it says, and one of the following studies. So it looks like the way it's written, I have to fail 3 things to,
Correct.
so if I fail,
I'm sorry. You have to pass 3. I apologize. You have to pass 3.
yeah, I don't think it says that to me. If you want to read that, the way that the way I read that, huh? Because you say shall not, so it says not, English, if I failed English and math and one of the following. That's the way I read that. So I have to fail 3. So maybe it would say if I fail English or math and one of the following.
Dr. Sanford?
Yeah.
The student's going to have to pass English and math in order to be promoted.
So
it's
it would
the
say
and.
English,
The and.
if he fails English or math, right? No?
No, it's
Help me
and.
understand this. We need a truth table.
Dr. Sanford, would you
It's late for
address
me,
it,
I'm
please?
sorry.
The student has to pass English and math to be promoted, regardless of the others.
All right, let's let Dr. Sanford.
Yes,
They have to pass 3,
I would be
English and math, and one of the others.
Yeah, I would probably recommend we reword that.
Reword.
You know, make that clear.
Okay.
It's written in the negative.
written in the
And
negative.
we need to make it in the positive. We were trying to retain the original wording without making that change, but we will make that change so it's positive.
We'll put it in the affirmative. The reason why we couldn't do that is we were just revising the present
I
language in
understand.
pupil progression. So we'll do it for clarity purposes. We'll
I
put it
think
in the
we all
negative, in the
understand.
affirmative.
Good, thank you.
Yes, no problem.
All right, Mr. Jeter?
I just want to make sure that the policy changes that we have at the local level here in St. Tammany Parish, that Bessie and the Louisiana Department of Education is not involved in this, and if it is, are we in compliance?
All of these are local pupil progression, so pupil progression promotion is left up to the individual districts.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Bellisario?
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
So to put it positively, a student must pass English, math, and one of the other 2.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's what it is, yes.
Ms. Seeley?
My question on the floor is this needed to be done by you all or us before we vote on it in a positive statement?
I was going to ask that, because you made the motion, would you accept that it's written in the affirmative that a student must pass in grades 7 and 8 the following: English, language arts, and math, and one of these subjects, science or social studies?
I agree that it could be amended to that.
All right. And Mr. Jeter, you second that?
And for next week's vote, we'll have the changed wording.
All right. Any other questions from board members on that? Do we have any comments from the public on recommendation number 7? If not, please vote. Voting on recommendation number 7. Ms. Campbell, do you have the results for us?
It's unanimous, but for some reason it's not coming.
All right, the vote is unanimous. It's not appearing on the screen, but the vote is unanimous for recommendation number 7. We'll move on to recommendation number 8.
Recommendation number 8 also involves 7th and 8th grade. This revision was submitted by the principal focus group. The proposed recommendation is to revise the promotion policy for grades 6 through 8 to include If a student fails the same subject for 2 consecutive years and is below basic in the same subject, then the student is subject to intensive intervention. The advisory committee's rationale for the proposed revision is to provide additional supports to struggling students to foster academic growth.
All right, do I have a motion? Mr. Kuzan? Oh, Mr. Kuzan's already got that, and Mr. Jeter will give us a second. All right, discussion on recommendation number 8. Ms. Bellisario.
For the benefit of everybody, could you explain a little more about the intensive intervention and the fact that the student could be promoted onward?
Absolutely. I'm going to invite Ms. Bauer up to talk about the intensive interventions.
Okay. In grades 7 and 8, we typically, when we're looking at students that are in this particular scenario, we usually advise that they take a study skills course as one of their electives. And in that course, the way we've written that scope and sequence, we've written it in a very diagnostic, prescriptive manner, so we can figure out exactly where the area of support is needed and then actually intervene in that class and tie it to the core subject at the same time. And then they can move on. Yes, ma'am.
All right, any other questions on recommendation number 8? Do we have any comments from the public on recommendation number 8? Ms. Campbell, would you open voting, please? The motion was made by Mr. Kuzan, seconded by Mr. Jeter. Let's see.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, the results are 15 yeas. Thank you very much. We'll move on to recommendation number 9.
Recommendation number 9 also involves 7th and 8th grade. This revision was submitted by the principal focus group. The proposed recommendation is to revise the paragraph and grading policy regarding the administration of quarterly exams. The advisory committee's rationale for the proposed revision is to reduce the amount of cumulative testing and increase instructional classroom time by leveraging existing interim assessments.
Okay, do I have a motion to accept recommendation number 9?
Yes.
Mr. Womack and Ms. Mullet will be our second. All right, do we have any questions on recommendation number 9? Mr. Derman?
Just for clarification, when we're looking at the upper statement versus the lower statement, and it says there shall be no exemptions. Down below it says there shall be no exams.
Oh, that was, yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm all for not taking tests. At least I was when I was in school.
We'll make note of that. That's okay. We'll make note of that. That was an
All
error.
right.
Thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Derman. Mr. Betancourt?
I was gonna address the same thing, so I'm done.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the public on recommendation number 9? If not, we'll go to voting, please, on recommendation number 9, made by Mr. Womack and seconded by Ms. Mullet. Mr. Loop? We got it. I think we got it. Okay, great. All right, we have 15 yeas on that, so we'll move on to recommendation number 10.
Final recommendation tonight involves 9th through 12th grades. This revision was submitted by the principal focus group. The proposed recommendation is to revise rank and class policy to include the word Carnegie in front of the word credit. The advisory committee's recommendation to add the word Carnegie before the word credit is merely a semantic change intended to bring further clarity to the process and will have no substantive effect on the ranking class process. This is, again, the third year in a row we have just brought, verbiage to you to clarify ranking class. All it is just defining what a credit is in high school.
All right. Mr. Hersey has made that motion, and Ms. Drucker has seconded. Do we have questions from board members on recommendation number 10? No questions from board members. Do we have any comments from anyone in the public on recommendation number 10? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Jeter, did you have a question?
You used Carnegie and credit. Take the two words and explain them both, if there is a difference.
They just go together. In high school, we define accumulation of credit for promotion to the next grade as a Carnegie credit. It's a unit used in education to measure whether or not a high school student has earned a credit to be promoted to the next grade.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Any questions from the public? Comments from the public? All right, we'll vote on recommendation number 10. Motion was made by Mr. Hersey and seconded by Ms. Drucker. If everyone would please vote. Mr. Jeter, you got it? Okay. All right, we have 15 yeas on that motion.
Thank you very
Ms.
much.
Stradberger and Mr. Carlo, Ms. Lane. We appreciate those recommendations from Pupil Progression Plan. It was a little bit cumbersome to get through it, but we did it, and we know that it's very important, and we do appreciate all the support and answers to our questions. Thank you so much. All right, if there's no further business to come before this meeting, we'll adjourn and regroup for the Business Affairs meeting in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Good evening and welcome to our Business Affairs Committee meeting for this evening. Mrs. Campbell, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Hannigan? Mrs. Heinz? Mr. Derman? Mr. Loop? Mr. Harrell? Mr. Nation?
Here.
Mr. Jeter? Mrs. Seeley?
Present.
Mrs. Drucker?
Here.
Mr. Betancourt? Mr. Womack? Mr. Hersey? Mrs. Mullet? Mr. Kuzan? Mrs. Bellisario?
Okay, thank you. As the invocation and pledge were said at our previous committee meeting, they'll be dispensed with here. Are there any visitors that committee members would like to recognize?
I do.
All right, Mrs. Mullet.
A gentleman that lives in my district, Jim Bro.
All right, welcome, Mr. Bro. All right, there were no persons requesting time on the agenda. We'll move on now to the approval of the June 7 committee as a whole minutes. Is there a motion?
Hold on, miss.
Mr.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Derman moves to accept the minutes. Mr. Womack seconded. Any discussion by committee members? Any discussion by the public? Okay, open voting.
I've already voted him present. Here he comes.
You could have voted for him. Well, I'm gonna do that on television.
I wouldn't do it behind TV either.
Everyone voted? Hey,
Mr. G, oh, okay, Mrs. Bellisario. Okay, here we go.
Close it. Close it.
What do you mean, close it? It was unanimous. Okay, let me go. Sometimes it'll pop up if you go. There we go.
Here we are. And the minutes were approved unanimous. All right, we'll move on to item 4A, consideration of a new policy for electronic telecommunications devices. Superintendent Folds.
Thank you, Mr. Nation, board members. I'm not sure why my name is here. Mr. Kosei can certainly work on this as well. But what you find in your packet, as well as in board docs, was a draft of a new electronic cell phone policy, if you will, for our school system. I think I've been quite honest with you in the past to tell you that we had a policy in the past that I'm not, and you heard our advisory panel speak to it as well, a policy in the past that I'm not sure that we were following it to the full extent. So what we're trying to do here is put a policy that basically mirrors what the practice is in our schools. We have worked with principals on this, and we've worked with my advisory panel as well as others. So we think this is a policy, certainly a starting point, and subject to tweaking as we go through the years with technology and education. But the policy you find here is the one that we're recommending, and certainly be glad to answer any questions that you may have about it.
Okay, is there a motion to approve this policy? Mr. Hennigan moves. Is there a second? Oh, Mrs. Drucker seconds. So the motion is on the table for changing the policy. All right, we'll open the floor for questions and comments, and we'll start with Mrs. Bellisario.
Thank you. My first question, I guess, is to David Pittman. Is Louisiana Law Revised Statute 17239 still on the books as originally written? Or as we were given it, I should say.
The electronic telecommunications devices. I don't think it's changed.
Okay.
One moment. But I do not recall any revisions in the last number of years.
Okay. The reason I ask that is, without reeling off all the various electronic devices, it says that state law prohibits any student from having them in any public school building or on the school grounds or in a school bus. So basically, this revised policy sort of goes along with that revised statute. If I'm reading the wording, and this is where I have a slight problem with this, it looks as if, and correct me if I'm wrong, a student could bring a cell phone to school, but he can never use it, except in the one crisis situation, which would be when there's an imminent threat to public health or safety which may result in the loss of life or injury. As I read it, that is the only time he could use a cell phone, in the school, anywhere in the school, during the school day, or on a bus. So of course, then I think to myself, really, why bring it if you're really forbidden from using it? So I did contact Mr. Folse, and I said, why are we saying that you can bring a cell phone to school if you can't use it in ordinary circumstances? And I believe the answer is parents want their children to have a cell phone in case there's a difficult situation.
I think that's accurate, as well as a case of after-school for activities.
And after-school
Ball
activities,
games,
right.
sporting events, band practice, communicating with their children from that way as well. And the part that I read on the statute, I think also gives the principal the authority to allow that to be used. It goes on, the statute goes on to read that it
Right.
prohibits it unless authorized by the school principal or his designee, which would certainly we would meet the criteria for that. So what I see this as, the cell phone should be kept, put away, turned off, only used in an emergency situation as defined, and, you know, sore throat, I want to check out to go home is not an emergency situation.
Okay, right.
We would follow the normal procedure of
Right.
getting the pass, going to student services, but an emergency situation as defined by the policy, as well as for parents and to communicate with their students, and students communicate, practice is running late. Can I stay and go to the basketball game tonight? Any of those things that, quite honestly, these students are doing now with the cell phones.
So we would not be in violation with state law if we allowed them to use it for other reasons, because the state law says not in a public building, on school grounds, or on a
I think the
bus.
state law would allow it, but our policy would prevent it from happening. It would be allowed to do it, but our policy would not, except for what we're stating. So
Okay.
from what I understand, I've talked to a lot of other school systems, and I actually made a little chart of a few of them, and many of them are in the same line as us and following the same procedures and
Okay.
policies as us, and so it certainly is being used across the state.
Okay, I had,
I
no,
was going to say, it's the same law is on the books since 2003, so it hasn't been modified.
actually, I thought okay. I was thinking we had passed this previous to that, but maybe not.
The law itself.
Yeah, okay. I'm just a little concerned that one of the things I hear from teachers most about is the difficulty of trying to control students who want to sneak the cell phone out, go on social media, use it somehow in the classroom. And I just hope that if we change to this wording, it won't make the matters worse.
I quite honestly think it will make it better, because I think it will give consistency across the parish at all of our different schools. And it will be very clear that you can have a cell phone, but it must be turned off. And our policy now does not state, it just says you can't have a cell phone. I think, I mean, they're bringing cell phones to school.
I know that.
Okay, so we need to address the issue and either say, we're not going to allow cell phones, and pack this boardroom with parents who believe for safety and for convenience that their child needs a cell phone. Or we can put a policy together that's more consistent with what's happening. I think this policy mirrors what we're doing now, for the most part. And I know, I agree with you totally, we have concerns and issues and problems, but I don't think adding this policy is going to make those concerns bigger. In a way, it's going to make us consistent across the parish, and it's going to require principals, teachers, and others, disciplinarians, to follow the procedure that's in place, and we'll make a big push out to everyone of what we're trying to do and make them aware as soon as possible. And look, I'm whatever enough to come back from now and semester from now and say, this is not working, can we try something else? But I think this is better than what we're doing.
And with this policy, they still have to have it out of sight, turned off.
Right, I do understand that's the policy. What happens if they don't? What is the first thing a teacher should do?
We're going to probably stick to the same consequences we have under use or related disruption, which, it can start with a detention. They may, depending on us tweaking it as the superintendent's talking about, we may start with a reprimand. We'll have to discuss that, of course.
Okay. And the only other concern I had, back in the late 1990s or perhaps early 2000, we had the superintendent from the Columbine school area come speak to us at Slidell High, and he stressed that one of the biggest problems they confronted, and perhaps we'll find a way around this, was once the incident started, so many students used their cell phones that they and the law enforcement, first responders, parents, everybody, no one could communicate.
Yeah,
And I don't know how
I remember that, and I remember going to workshops
Right.
myself after, and that as well. A couple of things, I think the technology has improved some, but I also believe that could be a problem. I mean, I've read about it before. In neighborhoods, you go to a ball game and everybody's using their cell phone, and the signal slows down a lot in the Superdome. It happens all the time. I think another thing that we do have going for us now is the radios that we have, that
Yeah.
each principal has, that directly communicates with law enforcement through those P25 radios. And I'm going to tell you, whether we have this policy or not, if there's a situation at a school, they're pulling out their cell phone.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, that's an issue, whether you pass this policy or we continue to do what we're doing now. And that is going to be a problem, because when there are situations, when we deal with you know, the day that we had school with the hurricane winds. I mean, we had students there pulling out their phone and texting as well. So, I mean, that's just the world that we live in now. And I think this is a policy, as a start to move us where we need to be. Maybe it's not the last spot, but it's a start.
Okay, I guess my final thought was, if we pass this policy as it's worded, and I'm not sure, I may abstain tonight, I don't know. How are we going to?
I'll call you on your cell phone tomorrow and try to get you to vote.
How are we going to convey to students, yes, we passed our policy and you can bring your cell phone to school, and they will still not use them? How do we convey that?
I mean, just like we do any other rule, it'll be changes in our handbook. It'll be part of our administrators' conference. It'll be part of PTA meetings. It'll be part of Meredith's social media.
Orientation of our students, yes, sir. I'm sorry.
It'll be part of orientation of our students.
Yes, sir.
And other things that go along with that. Yeah, so I mean, every time we change any policy, we're gonna communicate it out as well. I mean, it might take some growing pains for some of them, but I mean, I think all of them are aware now that they're not supposed to have it on, and when it goes off, then they the punishment. I don't think this will be a surprise to any of them. I really don't. I appreciate the questions, and it's good thoughts, for sure.
Thank you, Mrs. Bellisario. Mr. Hennigan.
Thank you, Mr. Nations. Yeah, positive step. I like this. I was maybe a question to Mr. Kosei, if you were in these meetings. I noticed that you say you can't use it on the bus. What was the thinking behind that? Was there a concern disrupt the bus drivers?
Yeah, we've always said the bus is an extension of the classroom. And we just think, for 30, 40 kids on a bus with one driver, that's just would be too much at this point,
And they might use these things for things they shouldn't be using them for on the bus as well. We don't have the same type of supervision, let's say it's a less structured environment.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a part of the reason why we would look at that.
Okay, all right, well,
yeah.
I predict. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hennigan. Mr. Bettencourt.
Is this the old policy, this sheet of paper that we have, or is this the new one?
That's the old one. Here's the new one right here. It's on your computer.
I don't know how to do all.
Okay, it's right here.
Okay. Because I was reading stuff on the old one that
Yes,
needed
it's on
to
your
be
electronic
changed.
device.
All right, thanks. I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Bettencourt. Mr. Womack.
Me? I'm just asking, are there any other groups, whether it be maintenance, whether it be computer people, air conditioning people, any other groups that are exempt from the rules that we enforce with the students that are in fact exempt from what we impose on the students? I'm just asking.
No, sir. The students are the only group of stakeholders, if you will, that are not allowed to bring cell phones.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Womack. Mrs. Mullet.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. I just want to say that I do happen to agree with Mr. Folse on this. I do think that the punishment, whether these kids have them now, which I'm going to be very honest, my kids graduated in 2002, 2004, and 2009, and they all had their cell phones in their backpacks for emergencies. And if they used them at school, I knew that they would get in trouble, and one of them did and got his cell phone taken away. And I really see this cell phone policy as completely outdated, and I believe that this is a good start, and like Mr. Folse said, if we need to do some tweaking, we will. Consequences, just like anything else. I mean, we have rules about fighting, and kids unfortunately fight, and they have consequences. This is just the same as any other rule that they break in our school system. And I think the 3 kids who don't bring the cell phones in our school system, because we have a no cell phone policy, will now bring their cell phones along with all the other ones that have been bringing their cell phone. That's all.
Thank you, Mrs. Mullet. Mrs. Hines.
I just would like to add that I agree with Ms. Mullet, and Ms. Belisario has a concern about the state law, and that might be something we would need to address with our legislators at some point. So I just thought I'd bring that to your
All right.
attention.
Thank you, Mrs. Hines. Mr. Kuzan.
Thank you. I think that I agree with the policy. I just think we need to have uniform enforcement of the rules, and everybody have to understand what they are. Thank you.
And we'll work through that, Mr. Kuzan. I didn't want to involve principals in giving me input on a discipline for a policy that's not yet been passed. So it'll be on our discussion at the administrators' conference, and we'll look at different things depending upon input we get from the administrators there as well. So
Thank you, Mr. Kuzan.
makes sense.
Mrs. Drucker.
I just had a question. Did our student board have any input in our cell phone policy?
Yes, ma'am. Much helped us write the policy, the draft.
And my part two question is, will they have also input on the consequences too as well?
I don't think. No, we'll involve them.
I thought you were being
too.
open.
No, but yeah, we'll involve them as well. They'll just be happy for this part of it, and, but I think getting the input from the principals will be helpful, because they're the ones that have dealt with the cell phones going off in the past, and they know how much a problem it can be, and the teachers. So we're gonna try to get where everybody can feel it's a win-win for everyone. That's what we're shooting for.
Well, I'm very happy to see this policy because it brings us up to date.
Yeah, I agree.
Because, having a policy and that we're not aligned, it's kind of moot to even have it written in our handbook. So I'm glad to see this. And, again, only in emergencies.
Correct, and it's pretty well defined.
It is well defined. So I thank you so much for working on this
Yeah.
and to bringing it up to date.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mrs. Drucker. Mr. Luke.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Nation. Obviously, being an administrator, you go crazy with cell phones and
Right.
trying to be having brought to you constantly and that sort of thing. But the one thing that seemed to work discipline-wise was to take it away from them and make the parent come get it. They very, very seldom did the parent ever have to pick it up a second time.
Thank you, Mr. Luke. All right, any comments or questions from the public? All right, not seeing any there, we'll open the floor for voting. Okay, vote is in, 14 yeas, no nays, and 1 abstention. All right, so motion carries. All right, moving on to item B, consideration of school board policy, section I. Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. Tonight's Section I was sent to you in advance. The information was also reviewed at last month's work session. Changes were made to the final version for your approval. Dr. Sanford and I are here to answer any questions on policy Section I.
Okay, is there a motion to, oh, Mrs. Hines, and Mr. Moves, and Mr. Jeter seconds. All right, the floor is now open for discussion. Mr. Kosei or Dr. Sanford, anything you would like to add at this point?
No, sir, not at this time.
Okay, thank you. All right, not seeing anyone queuing up, we'll go to the public. Any questions or comments from members of the public regarding section I? Okay, not seeing any there, we'll open the floor for voting. Mr. Womack, we need you to vote.
I'm sorry.
Okay, and motion is adopted unanimously. All right. Annual uniform report, Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. This annual uniform report was also sent in advance, and Dr. Tillman is available for any questions the board may have.
Okay. Do committee members have any, we need any questions for Mr. Tillman? Okay, Mrs. Hines?
My question is, I see that Lakeshore is not up for voting for the next year, but when we had the discussion regarding school safety, we discussed the idea of having the schools that did not have uniforms vote this coming school year. And I believe that would include Lee Road School too, and I don't remember whether Lee
Yes,
Road is
that's
up.
included in.
Yes, Lakeshore is included this upcoming school year to vote with everyone else.
Not by this.
Not by this status, current.
Well, the way I read the report, I didn't come up with that idea. So I wanted to make clarification that they were, and if they were not, then I would like to make a motion that they do vote this year.
I have a bullet,
Okay, I see
slide
that.
3,
It's right there,
Slide 3.
Thank you.
Covington High, Fountain Blue High,
Okay.
Manville, Pearl River, Lakeshore,
Well, that's
and Lee Road.
Thank you, that's my oversight then. Thank
Yes,
you.
ma'am.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Hines. Mr. Bettencourt?
How soon after school starts will the parents vote on it?
The process, it all starts after January, starting in February.
Oh, so they don't start voting when school kicks in?
No.
They vote next semester, the
Yes,
second
sir.
semester?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I think the discussion from the last time around was to keep it consistent with what we had done in the past, and that's the policy and the timeline we've passed.
Right.
And we would vote in January, and then anybody passes, it would be implemented for fall of 2020.
The following year. Okay,
The following
thank you.
year. Yes.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bettencourt. Mr. Hennigan?
Yes, thank you. Very good, Raphael, thank you for doing this. The one thing I would want to stress to the board, when we first went through this back about 20 years ago, it was important to the board that there was communication to the parents. It wasn't just a send it home in a newsletter without any advertisement. I'm assuming we're going to keep the same
Absolutely.
level of effort that we've done in the past.
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
good, thank you.
As well as, where we are with social media, I mean, I think it's gonna be an opportunity to even do a better job. And my goal is to get 100% participation vote, then we have a true indication of what the parents want. So our challenge is to get as many people to vote as possible. Yes, sir. Totally agree.
Thank you, Mr. Hennigan. Anyone else? All right, any comments or questions from the public? All right, thank you, Mr. Tillman. Moving on now to our monthly maintenance and custodial report.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. Posted in advance is that report for you on board docs as well. And Mr. James Williams, our supervisor of maintenance, is here with Mr. Jeff Davis and Dale Rourke if you have any questions for that report.
All right. Any questions from committee members about the monthly maintenance and custodial report? Okay, moving on.
Monthly risk management report posted in advance as well. Kurt Gaspard, our risk manager, is here to answer any questions relative to that report.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Gaspard? All right. And monthly transportation report.
Also posted in advance, Ms. Donnell Buell and Ms. Lisa Lewis, our assistant directors of transportation, are here with any questions that you may have for that report.
All right. Any questions regarding transportation? All right. Thank you, Mr. Kosei.
Thank you, Mr. Nation.
We'll put in a good word for you with Mr. Chavia.
Thank you.
All right. Ms. Tipton.
He needs it.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Nation. Our first item is recommends acceptance of Abney Elementary School classroom wing and gymnasium re-roofing as substantially complete, subject to architect's recommendations, submission of all regulatory requirements, and approval of Superintendent Foltz, St. Tammany Parish School Board Project Number R0023.
Okay. Mr. Hersey makes that motion. Is there a second? Mr. Kuzan seconds. Any questions or comments from the public? From committee members? All right. Any questions or comments from the public? All right, we'll open the floor for voting. Okay. All right, and the vote is unanimous. All right, item B.
We recommend acceptance of Mandeville Elementary School roof replacement as substantially complete, subject to architect's recommendations, submission of all regulatory requirements, and approval of Superintendent Folse, St. Tammany Parish School Board Project Number R0029.
And I happily make that motion. Is there a second? Okay, Mrs. Drucker, seconds. Any questions or comments from committee members? And I can attest to the roofing work that's being done, since my property adjoins Mandeville Elementary School, and they're even out there on Sunday. So, I mean, they're moving on. So, all right. Any questions or comments from the public? All right, we'll open the floor for voting. All right, and motion is adopted unanimously. All right, moving on to item C.
We recommend acceptance of Mandeville High School modular relocation and infrastructure as substantially complete, subject to architect's recommendations, submission of all regulatory requirements, and approval of Superintendent Folse, STPSB project number P0198.
Mr. Hannigan, would you like to make that motion?
I'll second that.
All right, moved by Mr. Hennigan, seconded by Mrs. Drucker. Any questions or comments from committee members? All right, any questions or comments from the public? All right, we'll open the floor for voting. Mrs. Heinz and Mrs. Belisario? Okay, they're in. And the motion is adopted unanimously. Item D.
We recommend acceptance of Whispering Forest Elementary School exterior roof and waterproofing repairs as substantially complete, subject to architect's recommendations, submission of all regulatory requirements, and approval of Superintendent Folse, STPSB project number R0033.
Second.
Mrs. Mullet moves, second by Mr. Jeter. Any other comments or any questions or comments from committee members? Any questions or comments from the public? We'll open the floor for voting. And the motion is adopted unanimously. All right, and your monthly construction report.
Thank you. Summer projects are progressing well. Modulars have been delivered and set at Madisonville Elementary, and the general contractor is installing walkways, electrical and plumbing, and special systems to the buildings. The modulars that were moved to Mandeville High are in place, and the project is complete. Roofing at Covington Elementary, Carolyn Park, Abney, Pineview Middle, Whispering Forest, Mandeville Junior, Mandeville Elementary, and Creekside Junior are complete or near completion. Site improvements at North Shore High, Mandeville High, Covington High, Salmon High, and Slidell High are progressing. Masonry repair and waterproofing for portions of Clearwood Junior High and Pontchartrain Chafuncta is progressing. The exterior steps and ramps are being formed and poured at Pupil Appraisal Building, and the interior finishes are progressing well. The renovations at Safe Haven for the RISE facility are progressing. The walls are being prepared for painting. Electrical conduit is being run, and work in the restrooms is underway. At Slidell High, foundations for the new kitchen are being prepared for concrete to be poured. Structural steel is on site. Underground plumbing for the girls' side locker room is being installed. Architects are working on developing the design documents for the additions at Madisonville Elementary and Mandeville High. Review of the Mandeville High project by the City of Mandeville Planning and Zoning Commission was completed at their meeting this week. And the limestone parking lot portion of work for the Mandeville High project is advertised for bids. I'm glad to answer any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Tipton regarding her?
Other than that, not much going on this summer in construction.
Very good. Mr. Betancourt.
Thank you. It's not for Ms. Tipton. I want to go back to the maintenance department because my computer was being worked on when that came up. I just want to thank them. They jumped on that project at Maroney, cleaning up the ditch or drainage area and stuff. And from what I'm been told, they did a great job. And I've got emails from a lady that was ecstatic and stuff. She was real happy with her ditch, or the ditch. So thank y'all, appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Betancourt.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or for Ms. Tipton? All right. Thank you, Ms. Tipton. And before we move to Ms. Prevost, I would like to, I don't think I've done this, I've been intended to do it for a couple of meetings. There's been a nice little addition to every school in the district, and that's we have raised the Louisiana flag over all the schools. And I asked Mr. Foltz to consider that, a while back, and he did that. And so thank you, Mr. Foltz, for that. So all the schools now fly the U.S. flag as well as our state flag, which is a nice addition to all the schools. So thank you, Mr. Foltz.
Mr. Kosei coordinated those efforts. It worked out good.
He hoisted each and every flag, I'm sure.
There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Kosei. All right. Moving on to business affairs with Mrs. Prevost.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. The May financial report was sent to you electronically, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Any questions regarding the monthly financials? All right.
The monthly purchasing report was sent to you electronically, and Ms. Stevens is here to answer any questions you have.
Any questions for Ms. Stevens? All right. That brings us to the end of our agenda. Now we'll move on to announcements by Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Nation. There will be a special board meeting immediately following this one to be held in executive session. I'm asking everyone to please stay. The regular board meeting will be held next Thursday, July 19th at 7 p.m. There will be a special board member the following Thursday, July 26th, for expulsion appeal hearings. So please mark your calendars. The next 2 weeks, next 2 Thursdays, we do have meetings.
Okay.
Next Thursday and the following.
All right.
And that's it.
Thank you, Mrs. Mullet. With no further business to come before the committee, the meeting is adjourned.